Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of Leviticus. We're now in chapter 11. By way of review, chapter 11 begins with and then. With the and then, we are given to understand that this took place after chapter 10. Now, at the end of chapter 9 and then chapter 10, we were shown that God is a consuming fire. God accepted the Olah of the Israelites in the end of chapter 9. And then at the beginning of chapter 10, we have the two sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and they offered strange fire. What God did not command them to do, they thought that it was appropriate to do it in the sanctuary to offer to God. And God struck them down and burned them up and killed them. And here lies our very important lesson. God is a consuming fire because he is able to send fire to eat up one, the burnt offering, or two, to destroy Nadav and Avihu because they violated God. They treated God as not holy. They disregarded the sacredness of God. They ignored the importance of God's house, God's rules. It is not up to them to do what they like. And hence, at the backdrop of such serious and severe repercussions of not doing what God commanded, as well as doing what God did not command, we see a very serious side of God. The glory of God is demonstrated by the fire. And so that in itself as a backdrop now comes to chapter 11 should help us understand that whatever is coming thereafter the death of Nadav and Avihu, the children of Israel, the sons of Israel, already will be trembling, fearful of God, and very attentive as to what God has to say. And then we come to chapter 11. With chapter 11, Jehovah spoke to Moses and Aaron. And here we have these statements saying to them, by way of understanding, this is not to say to the children of Israel, it is to say to El Adzar. And then we have the other son, Itamar. This is here looking at how important the role of the Kohanim will be. They are the guardians of the laws of God. They are the guardians to teach the law of God. They own that responsibility because they are set apart. They are replacing the firstborn that has been redeemed, and God has chosen the Levites, and particularly Aaron and his sons, to be the priesthood. Now, Aaron only have two sons left. And in chapter 10 demonstrates to us that God is very serious with this role. And so as God spoke to Moses and then to Aaron and then to say to Eleazar and Ithamar, they must be very clear how to instruct the rest. It says here, speak to the sons of Israel, saying. And so, in turn, they are to make sure that in all generations, they are to teach the children of Israel. The events of chapter 9 and chapter 10 is very fresh in their minds. God is now very serious about God's house, God's rules. We are now into a new aspect. It is God's people. Thereby, we have God's rules. These are the rules that is going to apply to the people, not just the Kohanim, but also to the people. We now need to appreciate that God is very serious when he leaves these instructions. They are not to trifle with God. God is not a God that you can fool around with. God is not a God that you can do what you like. God is not the God that you can do what you think you like. God is a God like any kings, that in his house there are only his rules. If you are his people, you follow his rules. No more, no less. This is a very Eastern Oriental understanding. In today's world, people don't really care much for the king. They may want to say and do things that is contrary to what the king may want. But in the olden days, in ancient days, they are very serious to obey the king because they can lose their life. Just as God has demonstrated in chapter 10 that Nadav and Avihu, even though they are the priests, they will have to die because they made light of God. They decided to do what they want in the house of God. And so God's house, God's rules have God's penalties. Now coming to chapter 11, God's people, God's rules. So who are these rules applied to? And so we have here the sons of Israel. They are not spoken to the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Assyrians, the Amalekites, the Philistines, or the Canaanites, or the Hivites, or the Egyptians. None of them. These laws is this particular rule. God's people, God's rules. And here in chapter 11 is exactly that. And it begins this way. These are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. We need to do a bit of retranslating here. The English is a bit confusing. So the first word here is the animals. These are the living creatures. Not just the animals, the living creatures you may eat. By eating, you may take as food. Among all the animals, and this one would be the Bahema. Bahema would be the four-footed, four-footed, and so we can call them animals that you find on the earth, and by earth it will be the land. What land? The promised land. We're not talking about all the animals all over the world. They can't be bothered. These are a very specific group of people. They are the sons of Israel. And so you can't be telling them about animals that does not exist in their eyes, that they can't see, they can't imagine. So we don't have animals here like the panda or the kangaroo or the whale because they can't see them. It's not that they don't exist, but we are talking about the behema that is on the Eretz, on the Haaretz, which is the promised land. The land that when they go in, these are the animals that they can eat. And so these animals that we're talking about among the living creatures in verse 3, these are the behemoth that they can eat. So what can they eat? Remember, this is spoken to the sons of Israel about the behemoth that is in the land. And so the audience here would be Moses to Aaron, Aaron to Eleazar and Ithamar, and then spoken to the sons of Israel. The instructions is actually quite simple. It says this: among the behemoth, then we have two particular words. Whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hoofs, chewing the cud, that you may eat. And so let's be very clear about the rules. See, God is a God of order. God is a God of rules. It is not an arbitrary law that he gives. And here he describes these are the land animals that we're talking about. And the first thing here is the one that breaks the hoof. It's into two. So if the hoof splits into two, that's good. And then we're talking about the second one is cloven hoofs. What is cloven hoofs? Well, the idea of cloven hoofs is this. This is a way where you have um, what we call splits. Splits of the foot and they stick together. And so this idea of cloven gives you the imagery of, say, a clove of garlic. If you have a clove of garlic, as you can tell, garlic has pieces stuck together. And so this is cloven. It is split and yet it is together. This is important for us to understand. One is that it is a split hoof and one is cloven hoof. So as long as you have the hoof that is not single, and the second part here is chewing the cud. This is important because the word here, chewing, really isn't chewing at all. The idea here is the cut, whatever goes into the stomach, ascends. This comes from the same word as olah, the burnt offering, and Allah, to go up. So this is not really chewing. It is when an animal eats the food and the food goes in to the stomach and then it comes back up the tract. So this is the idea of ascends the cud. It comes back out. And then they would chew it and then they would swallow it again. This is what it means by the ma'alat gera. It's ascending the cud. And so these are clear rules. Split hooves, cloven hooves, and ascend the cud that you may eat. And this is giving them a positive law. And the law says here, you can eat this. And to eat means you can treat this as food. Based on this rule, Then God explains certain examples. So, nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those that ascend the cut, or those that have cloven hoofs. And what are they? They are the camel, because although it chews the cud, but it does not have cloven hoofs. It has a single hoof. It is unclean to you. So you're not supposed to eat unclean foods. Now, notice this word here. It is unclean to you, not mankind. So you here would be the sons of Israel, and obviously the priesthood. So they are considered unclean because it is a ritual decision. Because there are times when they have festivals, there are times when they have to come to the tabernacle, the temple, they have to make offerings. So they must be very clear that if it is unclean to you and you eat it, you become unclean. And that's basically what it says. And the intent here is that it doesn't say that, no, you eat it, it will make you sick and you die from it. It is because you become ritually unclean and you may have to deal with the state of contamination. Next, you have all these animals. Now, I'm not going to go through the details of the animals because these are animals, for the large part, is found in the land of Canaan and the land of Israel, where they are about to go in. Some of them may have a bit of difficulty in describing because we don't see them anymore. So we'll use the English words that is here on the screen. The rock hyrax, because it chews the cud, but does not have cloven hooves. Then it is unclean to you. Right? That's verse 5. Now remember, unclean is tameh. Next, the hare, because it chews the cud, but does not have cloven hooves. It is unclean to you. And the swine, though it divides the hoofs, and this would be in verse 7, it has cloven hoofs. This is not divide the hoof. It has cloven, means that it is like this. It has all of these individual digits, but they are sticking together like a clove. They have cloven hoof. But having cloven hooves, yet does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. So we have a series of what we call animals, right? We have the camel, the rock hyrax, the hare. Here we have the swine. These are all unclean. Now, what is the purpose of this? Is because it is to demonstrate by example what these rules may be. So God's people, God's rules, and God is explaining rules by itself. If you don't understand it, or if you only look at the words, have no meaning until you can see how it is applied. And so God applies this as an example for them. And he says this: their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. They are unclean to you. And so again, to you would be the sons of Israel. And so not eat and not touch. Now, what does that mean? See, the carcasses means they are dead bodies. They are dead bodies. One is that because they don't eat, they are not slaughtered at all. And so if they die, they are not to touch it. But it is not that they touch it, they will die. If they touch it, they become unclean. And so they need to know what is clean and unclean, so that when they follow God's rules and rituals in the house of God, then the priesthood here will be able to discern and advise them that you are unclean. You cannot deal with this until you clean yourselves. And so we had in chapters 1 to 7 spoken about all the korban, the sacrifices, and how you need to be clean to do that or deal with it. Otherwise, the sin offering, the guilt offering, all these things will become a problem. And so the uncleanness needs to be dealt with so that you can approach God. But if you're not going to the temple or the tabernacle, then, well, yes, you are in a state of uncleanness, but you don't have to die. You just have to go and clean yourselves. And so all of this is for them to remember that these animals, if they eat them, you are unclean. So you are not fit to participate in the feasts and in the sacrifices. And then the priesthood, especially, must know how to advise the people. So I hope that we can begin to see the text itself. It is not that if you eat any of this that you will die. No. If you touch any of the carcasses, you will die. No. It is when you do that, you are unclean. And then you know that there is an implication towards your approaching God. And that must be clear. Remember, we are at the stage of recognizing God's people, God's rules. And so, as God's people, here God is saying, be careful that you watch what you eat. And so, we have first in the first passage there about the land animals, the behemoth, and what you can and cannot eat. Now we come to verse 9. Now, in verse 9, it goes on to another group of creatures. And it says, these you may eat of all that are in the water. And so now we are talking about the water animals, right? Water creatures. The water creatures are stated this way. It says, whatever in the water that has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the river, that you may eat. And by that, they can have this as food. And so let us be clear about fins and scales. Fins will be what we call the apparatus that the sea creatures use to move. Fins are like similar to wings. They are appendages and they are used for motion. And so these are important because there are creatures in the sea that does not have these fins. Now, what about scales? Scales would be what is on the skin. This is about what is on the skin. It can be removed, but it is a coat to protect the sea creature. And so they are not hardened skin. Scales are not hardened skin. They are on the skin. So that's the understanding. And so God gave the rules. They must have the appendages that they swim with. They must have scales that will protect them, and they must be able to be removed. If they cannot be removed, then you may not eat it. And that would be the way to understand. It says, but all in the seas, in the rivers that do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water or any living thing which is in the water, then they are an abomination to you. Now, notice it's not about just unclean. This is about disgusting to you. Now, who is you? The sons of Israel. Why? Because they are to approach God at some time. God says they are an abomination. They are disgusting. You shouldn't even eat them. It's not good for you. And it is definitely not going to help you to be clean. And so, abomination includes the idea of unclean, but also includes the idea of disgust. That you shouldn't even be tempted to want to eat it. Now, the land animals, you might, but these sea creatures are called abomination. The land creatures are just called unclean. So if you happen to eat them, you are ritually unclean, right? It doesn't have any magical potion that turns you into, a frog or anything like that. So it goes on. They shall be an abomination to you. You shall not eat their flesh, but you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. Since you don't slaughter them, don't even touch it, because it is a disgust. Whatever is in the water that does not have fins or scales, that shall be an abomination to you. So don't get into the water and do anything with such creatures. So that is what abomination literally means. They are both disgusting and they will contaminate you. Now, in verse 13, we begin another classification of creatures. In verse 13, we're talking about the birds, the creatures that actually have wings that fly. So, and these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. Notice birds here are creatures with wings that can fly, or they can flap their wings, but they have wings. So they shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. So notice abomination, you don't even come close. If it's just unclean, it's not going to kill you, but it's not disgusting. They are also good meat, but not for you. That's the difference. Why? So think of it this way: God's people, God's rules. For the behemoth that is supposed to be unclean, the rest of the nations eat them. But the sons of Israel are not supposed to. If they are not split hooves or they are not cloven footed and they don't chew their cud, they cannot eat those animals because it will contaminate their ritual cleanliness, but it won't kill them. In the case of the sea creatures without fins and scales, they are an abomination. With regards to these birds, also an abomination. So you take a look at this. They are the eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the kite, the falcon after its kind, every raven after its kind, the ostrich, short-eared owl, the seagull, the hawk after its kind, the little owl, fisher owl, screech owl, white owl, jackdaw, and the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe, and the bat. Now, this in itself seems to be a list, right? This is a list of abomination of birds. What about the other birds? And so there doesn't seem to be a rule. For example, fins and scales, split hooves or cloven footed, and chew the cud. But when it came to birds, this is a very specific list. And according to the ancient wise men from Israel. They have given us a couple of ideas of what they are to do. How do you determine what you can and cannot eat? And so it is something which they are supposed to deal with. See, we don't deal with that because we are not sons of Israel. But again, from a matter of principle, the Israelites need to know because the priests will have to teach. And so I want to share with you there are three characteristics for a kosher bird. And so it says that number one, they must have uh, an elongated toe. An elongated toe would be an animal that has a foot that has toes like that. That there's one toe that is longer than the other. Number two, it must have a crop, and number three, it must have a gizzard. If all these three characteristics exist in a bird, it is kosher. If any one of these characteristics does not appear in a bird, then it's not kosher. That would be how bird rules are in their way of looking at things. Why? Because many of these birds are claw birds. They use their claw to kill their food, and in so doing, uh, they are not this elongated toe. Because if you have an elongated toe, you don't have clawing ability. You only have walking ability. If you have a crop is an external, an additional pouch area in the esophagus. Now, a lot of birds have that because they are like a pre digesting area where they would eat in and then spit it out for the baby birds because it doesn't go into the stomach, it goes into the crop. That is what that means. Now, the gizzard, on the other hand, is a very tough muscle like pouch that sits at the back of the stomach where it uses to process hardened foods. And so these are the type of characteristics when they look at this passage here, that is why the eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the kite, all of these do not meet this kosher definition. Now, what about an owl? An owl does not have a crop. And so, as long as they have all three, the birds can be eaten, which means that in general, most of the birds that they have, like the pigeon, the chicken, they are all clean animals. They are okay. They are not an abomination, right? Not an abomination. We come to verse 20. Now, in verse 20, it says, all the flying insects that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you. Now, in verse 20, we are talking about flying insects. We have insects that flies and has four legs. Now notice insects has two fours and four legs, two forearms and four hind legs. This is how insects are structured, right? The two are four limbs and the four at the back are legs. And so that creep on all fours and they fly, so they have wings. And so they said, if you look at these, if they creep on all fours, they shall be an abomination to you. Yet these you may eat of every flying insect. You may eat that creeps on all fours. So there is an exception. The exception are these: those which have jointed legs above their feet with which to leap on the earth. And so we would be looking at animals, or we call it flying insects, that is more like this: two fours, and then another one, and then we have one hind leg that looks like this. So what is this actually? So you find that this is have jointed legs above their feet, is this part here. These you may eat. What are these that you may eat? The locust after its kind, the destroying locust after its kind, the cricket after its kind, the grasshopper after its kind. But all other flying insects which has 4 feet shall be an abomination to you. And so here God gave a small list of insects which they can actually eat. And so, do the Israelites eat insects? And the answer is yes. And so, in the wilderness, when you have no meat to eat, you can find insects, and these are the ones: the locust, the destroying locust, a kind of locust, the cricket, the grasshopper, and and all of these are fairly big, actually. When we say fairly big, please don't equate them to what you see in our country today. They would be possibly the size between 1 to 3 inches. And so they are for food when you have nothing else to eat. Now, so far, I hope that we get the picture. It is about you. Who is you? The sons of Israel, that you may eat, so that you know when the priesthood teaches you what you can and cannot eat, is to affect you whether you can come to God or not. You can approach the tabernacle or the temple or not, whether you can participate in the feasts and festivals or not, whether you can offer your sacrifices or not. So far we have reached until verse 23, that we have two types of eating rules. One is about clean or unclean, and one is about abomination. And I hope that we are clear how God dealt with all these, so that when they are into the land of Israel, they would know what to do. And they know that they are God's people and they had better follow God's rules. It is not that if they ate this and they'll drop dead the next day, but if they don't follow God's rules, God will not allow them to participate in the coming to God uh, events. And they have to deal with the uncleanness. And we will deal with the uncleanness next week when we come back for chapter 11, starting from verse 24. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.